Good morning, everyone. It's a joy to be back with all of you. I've been romping around the world for the last month, and it's a great pleasure to get to be home again with all of you. This is a very entertaining topic for me because at first, on the surface, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But then actually, as I began to think, I realized I actually have quite a lot of experience with this topic. Cast ye not pearls before swine. At first, we may rebel against that, thinking, well, that's rather insulting, isn't it? Because, of course, what Christ is talking about is encouraging us not to share too much of our spiritual experience with other people unless they are truly receptive to that. And, of course, there's a part of us that says, well, they're not swine, they're people, they're my friends, they're the people I grew up with, they're my co-workers. And of course, natural it is for joy to want to share itself. I'm sure we've all been in this position. We start meditating, we start reading the autobiography of a yogi, and next thing we know, we're having crackers and tea at the lunch break at work, and we're proselytizing. Hazi likes to tease me. He says that I'm a great proselytizer. Now, I don't know if he means great as in unstoppable or great as in, sophisticated. I'd like to think it's the latter. But the fact of the matter is I've been my entire life, and it's now a process for me of trying to learn the subtle art of proselytizing. But first, let me tell you how not to proselytize. So when I was a young boy, I always was deeply moved by Swami Kriyananda's music and by the vibration of Ananda. And actually, I want to pause myself and just thank the whole choir. That was one of the most moving renditions of Keep Calling Him that I think I've ever heard. I was very, very touched, so thank you all very much for that. And I'm so glad I didn't try to sing with you because I had way more fun where I was sitting. But what was very interesting was I knew at a young age that God was real and that He loved me and that I loved Him. But what was interesting was I also knew in the timidity of my young age that it wasn't mine to preach, that it was just mine to treasure. And I would have deep experiences. One in particular shines out in my own memory. When I was 12 years old at the Living Wisdom High School, or I suppose middle school, but they were sort of joined together at the time, and I was brought to a cold yurt, unheated in December. It was snowing, it was below 30 degrees, and we were freezing cold. And it was 8:30 in the morning, and we were supposed to energize and sit down and practice Hong Sa. I was 12 years old. This was miserable. And we had to do this every Tuesday, Thursday of the week, and every Tuesday, Thursday morning was just bitter. And so there I was. I energized. I sat down to meditate, and somehow, by the grace of God, I was sitting. I remember precisely where I was sitting. I remember the feel of the material under which my hand could touch. I remember exactly where it is. Even though they've demolished that yurt, I know exactly where this happened. Suddenly, through the veil of my ignorance, God came to me. Not in some tremendous way. It's not like Jesus Christ Himself came and walked with me and talked with me, but God came. And I knew that God came. And what was very interesting, actually, I'll share another element of this. In this meditation, I had this inner experience of divine light, and I realized, oh my God, that's divine light. And as soon as I had that restless thought, it was gone. And I was back again sitting in my little body with this realization, though, that I had experienced truth. And when the meditation ended and we all filed out of the little mandir and all my friends were griping and groaning about, I can't believe they make us do this, it's so cold, and the girls get to meditate indoors where it's warm, and I walked out. That was a constant point of humor for us, that we always felt that we got the short end of the stick. Actually, I could tell you lots of stories, but I won't. I'll save that for another satsang. But I walked out of that temple shaken to my core because I had seen the light. And I knew now for my own self that it was real. And so then what was interesting, cast ye not pearls before swine, as the years went forward and the Living Wisdom School faculty tried to teach my peers and I about Sanatan Dharma and the eternal truths, my friends would mock it. openly, in class, to the face of the teacher, and outside of that we'd mock and deride God. But what was interesting was I never quite could, because I always knew in my heart it's real. I've seen it. But for them, it actually threw them further away from the path to have people continually tell them that they weren't living up to spiritual teachings, which was an unfortunate byproduct of the moment. But for me, it was constantly a reminder, I'm not living up to my spiritual potential. Maybe I ought to. And what was very interesting was a few years later, I had another very profound moment. I think sometimes Divine Mother comes and shakes me by the scruff of the neck because I'm too dull-witted and stubborn to get the point any other way. And she came and she showed me that I was to dedicate my life again to this path and to this lineage of gurus, and that discipleship was to be my life. And with great enthusiasm and the zest of a young man, I took that with both hands. And 3 days later, I was back with my peers, and I was telling them eagerly about this spiritual experience and that great inner revelation and this deep resolve I had now to live for God. And I remember distinctly one of them looked at me and shaking his head, and he said, "That's great, man." And what was interesting was about 10 days later, I lost every single one of my childhood friends. In an instant, I was cast out because they could not relate to this new Keshava. They thought I'd lost my way, that I'd become one of the proselytizers. Of course, the funny thing was I had become one of the proselytizers. They were right. But what was very interesting was in that experience I began learning about this true teaching, cast ye not pearls before swine. And I've actually grown to learn in the last 12 years that that's not an insult, but it's actually an act of kindness. And I'll explain why. Because in those moments of me expressing my true inner nature to them, for them to be unable to understand rendered them incapable of relating to me as a friend. I took away their capacity to be kind to me because they had no context in which to relate to me. And so they did the only thing that they knew how, was to stop relating to me. And of course, coincidentally, that hurt my feelings. But think of what it did to them. Overnight, they lost one of their best friends, never to be seen again. And even still to this day, many of them can't understand for the life of them what I'm doing. Because I said too much too fast. I wasn't relating appropriately to their reality, which is the essence, I actually think, of this reading. This reading, in a way, is intimately tied to Swamiji's principles of education for life. That he says maturity is the ability to relate to other people's realities. Does a little piggy want pearls? He doesn't care about pearls. He can't tell the difference between pearls and gold and carrots. What he actually wants is carrots. And interestingly, too, God relates to us appropriately, doesn't he? God coaxes us with kindness, with love, with an appropriate next step to help us move towards him. And then it's us in our exuberance that turn around and tell others that they ought to be somewhere other than they are, that they ought to be greater than they are, more developed than they are, more devotional than they are, more in tune than they are. And in that, we actually harm them, don't we? And just as if you were to yell at a 4-year-old for not yet understanding complex analysis or calculus, they might grow up to hate the subject rather than grow up to love it. But if you take a 4-year-old and if you hope that one day that they will be a great physicist and you put them on a swing set, maybe that's the right way for them to start. God does this for us. God coaxes us through kindness. There's that wonderful song in the oratorio, "To souls that were fallen, he spoke of God's love and coaxed them with kindness to turn back again. Forsake, he said, the fulfillments of earth. for the comfort they bring you lasts hardly an hour. And so Christ is actually teaching us. He's telling us not to turn our backs on our fellow friends and all of our brothers and sisters, but he's telling us, reach out to them in the way that is most appropriate. Through kindness, through friendship, by relating appropriately to who they are. And how do we do that? How do we relate appropriately to other people? By learning to feel our heart in theirs, by learning to feel the Divine Mother in them, and to ask, how can I serve you, Divine Mother, in this other person? And you know what's magnificent is I've gone through a journey of the proselytizer. And maybe Hazi's right. Maybe I have become a great proselytizer. When we were in Italy together, I don't speak any Italian. My Italian is confined to ciao and ciao and un caffè. Turns out that's kind of all you need. There was actually a funny moment as an aside. It's been a great honor to get to work in the high school for many reasons. It's been profoundly uplifting for me. I've learned so much about Sanatana Dharma, about these teachings, about myself, about God. But it's been such an honor to work with this team. It's been the blessing of a lifetime. And for those of you who don't know, Kshama is what, 5'1", 5'2", 5 foot? Somewhere in there. But man, if small but mighty wore a human body, it would be Kshama. And I think sometimes she forgets that she's not 8'7" and 430 pounds of bioengineered muscle mass. But one day when we were coming into Florence, it was extremely late. We'd been driving for 8 hours. I was sick as a dog. And yeah, see, some of the students know. You have seen her. And there we were, and we were trying to park in a parking garage. And the streets of Florence are so small, forget about a 3-point turn, there's no chance. And we're stuck in this tiny row getting into a parking garage. It's 11:30 at night, we're all exhausted, and the Italian is yelling at Keshava. I think half of it was his hands, and the other half was Italian, telling her that you can't park here. And I swear to God, I took one look at him and I crumpled. I was like, I don't care, I'll drive wherever he wants me to go. I don't want to fight. I can't fight in Italian, I'm done. And Kshama duked it out with him on the spot, in Italian and in English and with gesticulations. And she just refused to budge. Victory demands the courage of conviction, Swami says, and Kshama had it. But at any rate, so Kshama was being courageous and lion-like and a great leader, and I was just being kind of a schlump because I didn't know what else to do. But I figured that I had other ways that I could serve God on that trip, and it turns out one of them is by being a proselytizer. And so about 2 days later, we're in Florence, and we decide that the greatest thing to do for the children would be to cut them loose and have a little adventure. So we define the parameter of the adventure as you have, 3-4 hours, you have to stay in teams of 2 or 3, and you have to meet us back at this particular time, otherwise you fail the primary objective and we punish you somehow. Nah, we didn't have to threaten them with punishment, it was implied. So, so at any rate, the children disperse and Kshama, Hazi, and I look at each other and we're like, hey, we're free, what should we do? So naturally, I say the only thing that a reasonable person would say, which is ice cream. And so we go to a gelateria. It was an amazing place. And I walk through the front door, and the man taking orders for the gelateria was so joyful. He had this wonderful big smile and these eyes that just twinkled with merriment. Then I walked up, and my Italian's terrible, and his English is actually way better than mine. So kind of between my horrible attempts beyond ciao, he took mercy on me and was trying to speak in English. And long story short, we got the order right. I'm sitting over there, I'm drinking my affogato, which is like one of the great inventions of mankind. It's ice cream and coffee. So at any rate, I finish, and I'm walking out, and we're ready to leave. And as I walk out, I stop myself, and I was like, no, there's something I must do. And I turn around to the man, and I just look at him, and I say, you are such a joyful man, aren't you? And he looks at me for a second like, am I asking you, do you want more ice cream? And I said, no, you are very happy. And he smiled and he said, yes, I am. And I said, thank you. It's such a blessing to be around joyful people. Thank you. And I walked out. And as soon as we got out of the threshold, Hazi turned to me and he said, proselytizer. And at first I was like, was I? But now I wear the badge with pride. Proselytizer. I was proselytizing, but I have learned. For I did not try and tell him, have you seen Jesus Christ? That probably wouldn't have worked so well because of the language barrier. But joy is the ultimate tool of the proselytizer. As Master said, shoot others with the buckshot of your smiles. That was my favorite pastime in Italy. Ciao, ciao, ciao. I got both hands out. I was doing really good. And I almost got run over by a Tesla, which I felt was like the spirit of Silicon Valley telling me that it was time to go home. I almost got hit over by the Tesla, and I was like, oh, ciao. Go with God. Okay. But what I've come to realize is, of course, what speaks louder than words? This is not a riddle. Your magnetism. Who you are. Sometimes, as Asha said, I'm sorry, I can't hear what you're saying over the thundering roar of who you are. This is how we proselytize. It's by being joyful, but not by the cheap, counterfeit joy of a forced happiness or a smile pinned grimly onto your face, but by the joy that is awoken through Kriya Yoga, through meditation, through attunement, through a heart that gives itself freely to God. How do you know the spiritual path is working? Well, I'll tell you how I know the spiritual path is working. I went through some tribulations fairly recently, and in the midst of pain, I realized that there was a spark of joy. Not just a little spark, but a dancing, scintillating light of joy amidst suffering. And I thought, Lord, how wonderful you are. For you have planted in my heart the one thing which I desire, your presence always. When I was in Los Angeles, I met a friend while, of all things, shirtless, in my garage, lifting weights. How many of you can say the same thing? I wonder. And there I was, and I was lifting weights, and a man stopped, and he looked at me, and I looked at him. And he walked on. And then a few moments later, he came back, and I thought, that's not a coincidence. So I put down what I was doing, and I waved at him. Had I known it, I would have used my favorite word at that point, ciao. But I didn't. So he came over, and we started talking, and it turns out he was a power lifter. He lived right down the street. And he saw me, and he was like, wow, you're lifting some serious weights. And I was like, yeah, I enjoy weightlifting. And he says, hey, we should work out together. Sure. So we went the next week. We had one workout together. We went and got sandwiches. It was a great date. And the next day, he invites me for coffee. I go have coffee with him. And he looks across the table and he says, I think we should become business partners. And I was like, what? I've known you for like a grand total of 6 hours, 4 of which were in the car. And he's like, I don't know, I got a good feeling about you. He said, I'm starting a new business. I know the technical components of the business. I am extremely good at that, but I'm not very good with people. I get shy around people. I don't know how to, he didn't know this word at the time, but he said, basically, I don't know how to be magnetic. And he said, you do. We'll be a great team. Will you be my business partner? And now the crazy thing was, I was sitting there and I thought, is this a scam? Is this a joke? But then I went into my heart and I thought, this feels like a good idea. And so I said, well, sure. And so anyway, long story short, a whole bunch of hoops and skips and jumps later, we were in business together. And actually, sure enough, we did run a very nice business together. But the real thing, I think the real reason that I was drawn into business with him, one, was it got to satisfy some vrittis of my own, and I learned some interesting skills. But what was interesting was he kept pestering me day after day. Keshava, what do you eat? What's your diet? Well, I'm a vegetarian. A couple weeks later, my friend became a vegetarian. Keshava, what kind of music do you listen to? So I told him. Next week, he's trying that music. Keshava, you sing, don't you? Yeah. Can you teach me how to sing? Sure. So I start teaching him how to sing. This goes on like this for years, and just always I could see him. He would come in and he'd look at me like, and then we'd move on. Years later, he started having some trouble in his life. We were no longer working together, and he asked me out for coffee. And he just starts telling me about the pain and the trouble and the grief in his life. And he actually just said, what should I do? And I said, well, as it happens, I'm starting a Raja Yoga class next week, and I think you'd really benefit from it because, it'll teach you how to meditate, and it'll teach you how to direct your willpower, and maybe you can, get a little bit more control over your heart. So we came to the class, and what was one of the most touching testimonials of my life was about 10 weeks into the class, the students all came back together, and I said, does anyone have anything they'd like to share from your practices during the last week before we begin our lecture today? He raises his hand. Normally, he was very shy and introverted, and he wouldn't share overmuch. And with great confidence, he said, I have something I want to say. Okay, what is it? And he looked around the room and he said, I've known Keshava for years, and I've always wondered, what is his secret? How is he so happy all the time? What does he have that I want? And he said, I've tried his diet. I tried his weightlifting techniques. I tried this. I've tried that. He said, I even learned music from him. And he says, I'm tone deaf. And I was like, and then he said, now I know what your secret is. Now I know why you're so happy all the time. Because I felt it too. It's this, isn't it? I said, yes, it's this. It's God. And it's the ability to find him in your own heart. But if I had started with him, there together lifting weights, hey, have you ever considered Jesus Christ? That might not have panned out so well. But unwittingly, through me, God was coaxing him with kindness to turn back again and to forsake the world, for its fulfillments last hardly an hour. And so perhaps what this reading is telling us is, yes, not just to be cautious of sharing our inner experiences too freely with others, but is also telling us to remember how to be a true friend, to relate appropriately to the realities of others, and to share the great joy of God through everything that you do. This is the most magnetic proselytizing of all, a life of happiness, the art of happiness. People can come, people can go, but if you can stand in your life and say, I know how to be joyful in myself, then the opportunities will come for you to share Master's vibration, Divine Mother's love. And in that sharing, we ourselves are blessed. But remember that that sharing doesn't have to come through standing on a dais, doesn't have to come through chanting the Lord's name, but it can come with a smile and a ciao. So let's try and remember this week to be appropriate, to treat others with love, with great kindness, on behalf of the Divine Mother whom we love so dearly. And by so doing, we will surely attract the goodness and the grace and the kindness of our Guru and of Divine Mother into our lives. And then we'll find her walking with us hand in hand in everything that we do. And we'll see her smiling at us through every eyes that we come into contact with. We'll hear her laughter ringing through every voice. And then we won't have anything to fear anymore. God bless you, friends.